Hello, History 362. So in our last lecture, we polished off the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic dynasty, and that really ends the political, geopolitical, military and diplomatic history that has admittedly driven a lot of our narrative in the course. I just want to, as the final lecture, to just kind of reflect briefly on sort of the periodization of the Hellenistic world. And as I mentioned starting off, this is a problematic periodization. Essentially, a German scholar, Droysen, simply kind of creates this concept which we have inherited. It defines things like college courses. But I like talking about periodization in all my classes, in part because I think it really forces us to think about continuity and change. And to think about how change is perceived and realized both on the ground and also in the broader perspective, longer term perspective. So actually I kind of wanted to focus on three things where there's actually a tremendous amount of continuity between the classical Greek period over the Hellenistic Greek period and even into the Roman Empire, the situation where we find ourselves at the end of our sort of geopolitical narrative, where Rome now has come to control what had been a great part of the Hellenistic world. So I think in terms of one key aspect of continuity must be the polis. The Greek city-state is the dominant form of kind of social organization in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the classical period, there's over 1,000 polis. It's going to continue to be throughout the Hellenistic period, although admittedly now polis have to deal with these powerful Hellenistic kings. Although, mind you, polis in the classical period had to deal with a powerful Achaemenid king, even though a few like Athens and Sparta also managed to be regional hegemons. So there are those polis will continue to exist and in many instances flourish. Yes, their kind of military ambitions may be curtailed, although we still have seen a few polis like Pergamon, like Syracuse, like Sparta that do have at least some military agency. But in many ways, the life of those polis continue. They continue to practice self-government with democratic forms increasingly being the norm. They oversee public works. They distribute grain and resources. They fund festivals and athletic activities. And they also negotiate with various donors to ensure that benefactions flow to the community from both great donors and even small donors. And indeed, now that I finally read and graded all your reviews, that was one reason why I assigned the book on Europism. One thing I liked about that book was actually, rather than treating Europism just as a phenomenon of the Hellenistic Age or as a kind of later phenomenon, it really tried to treat this as a phenomenon that develops over time and from the archaic age and archaic gift-giving to the development in classical culture, and then continuing not only in the Hellenistic Age, but into the Roman Empire. So indeed, those eulogistic impulses, the desire of benefactors to negotiate with cities for honors in exchange for various forms of benefaction, that's flourishing in the Hellenistic period, and it's going to flourish into the Roman Empire for at least the next couple centuries. So that's an instance of a cultural phenomenon that sees broad continuity, even though the last Hellenistic dynasty has been done away by Rome. And the polis more broadly is going to endure into late antiquity. It is a phenomenon and form of social organization that is quite immune to many forms, to many geopolitical regimes. Also, and I think this is somewhat important, one feature of the Hellenistic world is that Greek becomes the dominant lingua franca in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Now, in the classical era, Greek is without question, widely spoken language in the Eastern Mediterranean by Greeks and also by non-Greeks, since bilingualism is quite common. But the Hellenistic world, and indeed some of those geopolitical changes that we've talked about, the creation of Hellenistic kingdoms that speak Greek, and Greek is the administrative language. Colonization, which sees Greek-speaking soldiers and settlers settled not only in the Eastern Mediterranean but deep into Asia. That is going to make spread the Greek language quite widely, and without question make Greek the dominant language of the Eastern Mediterranean, the lingua franca. Even if you speak another language, if you want to travel anywhere, you really need to be able to speak Greek. And this leads to actually the development of a kind of universal dialect of Greek. If you go to the, say, 6th century BC, Greek has many dialects that are spoken, and Greeks themselves sort of complain or talk about how other Greeks talk in a funny way. You can see this actually in 5th century comedy. So for example, in the Lysistrata, there's a running joke on how funny the Spartan woman sounds with her thick sort of Spartan kind of country bumpkin accent. So out of all these Greek dialects, a kind of broad sort of super dialect develops called Koine Greek, Common Greek. Essentially, it's basically the Attic dialect with a few little tweaks. But the idea is that it's a type of Greek that you can speak and everyone can understand you, whereas they might not necessarily understand if you start speaking in a thick Doric or Iolic accent. So this Koine Greek, this phenomenon of now this sort of super Greek dialect, this is also going to transcend the Hellenistic Age. Of course, we've seen in the Hellenistic Age how other groups, including the Jews who translate the Bible, the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible, are actually starting to use Greek in some instances as their primary language, and therefore need scriptures translated into that language. This is going to transcend the Hellenistic Age as well. For the Roman Empire, I hope some of you will take History 364 next semester. But in the Roman Empire, the Romans caused the Western Mediterranean to largely speak Latin, and they do this through both their administration and also the colonization, the settlement of veterans who speak Latin. The Eastern Mediterranean is largely immune to that. It continues to be a Greek-speaking region. It is a place where people put up inscriptions in Greek. The Koine Greek dialect endures and indeed is dominant despite the realities of Roman administrative rule. So in this instance, the political story that we've been telling, Roman conquest and annexation, at least in the latter part of the Hellenistic period, does not lead to a change in sort of the linguistic mix. And that's that's actually quite notable. Now, some of that may be simply because many members of the Roman elite already speak Greek, so they don't need to change the language. They can administer the language administer the region in Greek. But some of it is just how deeply rooted Greek has become throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the Hellenistic period. And of course, one of the results of that is even though, say, Jesus had been an Aramaic speaker, and indeed the fact that he's an Aramaic speaker is the product of, is a sort of distant echo of Persian linguistic realities. The Achaemenid Persians use Aramaic as an administrative language, which is one reason it becomes so widely spoken. But despite the fact that Jesus is an Aramaic speaker, when it comes time for early Christians to write their initial scriptures, first the letters of Paul and then the Gospels, there's no question what language they're going to put it in. If they want to reach any pool of converts, they're going to write in Greek. So that's why the New Testament is written in the Koine Greek that had developed during the Hellenistic era. And this is, again, another sign, I think, of continuities that transcend the kind of geopolitical story that, admittedly, this course is based around. Now, of course, one thing that defines the Hellenistic Age. I mean, the justification for creating a course like this is admittedly Hellenistic kings, who, first starting with Philip II and then Alexander and then the subsequent successor dynasties, that makes Hellenistic geopolitics look very different from what, say, the kind of multipolar Paulus geopolitics look like in the classical period. But this also leads to a cultural development that again also sort of it provides us with an interesting play of continuity and change, and that is the ruler cult, the Hellenistic ruler cult. I realized I'd intended to do a lecture earlier on the ruler cult, and then 2020 just kept on cranking along, and we didn't do it. Although we did have some readings on the ruler cult, and I think encounter some when we talk about the Seleucids. So this is actually something that has its origins before the Hellenistic period, in that Greek communities sometimes honor living people with, again, cultic honors. This is done for the founders of colonies, the oikists of colonies. They sometimes receive honors, cult-like honors, and even festivals and celebrations while they are still alive. This is done with some generals. So, for example, the Spartan general or admiral Lysander seems to receive cultic honors. That is the kind of honors that you would give to a god, while he is reorganizing parts of the Eastern Aegean after the Peloponnesian War. So there had already been kind of experiments, or there was some antecedents towards worshipping a living human being, giving them the kind of honors that would ordinarily be reserved for the gods. However, once you start having these really powerful generals, and you need a kind of idiom to describe how they're much more powerful than even the average, Paulus elite, we start seeing an intensification of cities assigning divine honors to kings during the successor period. And Athens does this to Demetrius Poliorcetes, writing a beautiful hymn, for example, to him, and that sort of prays to him and beseeches him in the way that one would beseech a god. And this, of course, only intensifies. Now, what's notable is that early on, it seems this is largely driven not by the kings themselves, but by communities who basically set up a cult as a way of kind of negotiating with the king. That, if you send a letter saying we would like to request permission to set up a cult to you and to sacrifice, set up sacrifices or festivals to you, this is in some ways a way of professing your loyalty to the king. And of course, kings don't say no, even though there may not necessarily be a real kind of, I don't think there's a real theological basis. They don't believe that they're necessarily magic or immortal, at least most of them don't. But they like the idea of people in various communities coming together and having these what are essentially kind of rituals of loyalty and acknowledging their kind of subservience to the king. So this is going to continue all across the Hellenistic Age, these ruler cults. There is some evidence in the 2nd century that some kings, including the Seleucids, do take steps to kind of formalize and take some kind of top-down control of the ruler cults, and therefore have some control over which members of the royal family get cult, the nature of the cult, the finances of the cult, which of course they care about the money quite a bit. But even so, this is a widely spread phenomenon that nonetheless seems to really start out kind of bottom up. What's notable is that you would say, okay, well, now we've destroyed all of our Hellenistic dynasties. The Antigonids are gone, the Seleucids are gone, the Ptolemies are gone. And yet there is a real sense of continuity in that many of the Greek communities in the East that had offered cult to Hellenistic kings, now they look to Rome and say, okay, what we're going to do. Now, for a while it's complex. the one thing that confuses Greek communities is the Romans as a republic don't have any one figure. They just have a series of magistrates who are always swapping out. That, of course, changes because Rome, after a series of civil wars, now has an emperor starting around 31 BC when Augustus, Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, wins the Battle of Actium. And what's notable is very early on in Augustus's reign, we start getting petitions from particularly Eastern communities who want to set up a cult. And of course, this is initially there's some political ambiguity, given that not all the Roman senators necessarily want to see the emperor worshipped as a god. But pretty quickly, the Greek communities wanting to set up a cult to the emperor, this becomes a very widespread phenomenon, so that the imperial cult actually is kind of a fundamental institution of the legitimacy of the Roman emperor. But again, this is actually an example of how we see in some ways continuities from an institution used to negotiate and engage with Hellenistic kings. All of a sudden is a useful institution to do the same thing, but with the emperor in Rome. So on one hand, there's no question that I think in terms of kind of high politics, military affairs, the way we frame this course, essentially starting with the fall of the Achaemenid Empire and then ending with the advent of the Roman Empire, I think it makes perfect sense. But it's also, though, a reminder, on my point in kind of ending in these continuities, that life for many people went on in the same way. These cities continue their corporate existence. The rituals may oftentimes be not all that different in terms of how you think about the ultimate authority, the oftentimes foreign authority, and even linguistically, and of course the deeper way that language relates to our culture. Many things stay the same, even as we find ourselves now in the Roman Empire. So anyway, we will be offering the Roman Empire next semester, AHST 364. I will not be teaching it. I'm on sabbatical next semester, but it will be taught at this point quite likely by another excellent ancient historian in our department, Randolph Ford. So I hope if you enjoyed our survey of the Hellenistic world, you will consider continuing your explorations of the ancient world next semester. Guidance on the final will be coming out soon. I look forward to seeing your papers. For now, have a very safe and happy Thanksgiving, and we are definitely almost to the end. So at any rate, as you prepare for the final paper and final exam, all I can say is good luck.